What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. And this one is some of my early thoughts ahead of the Game Week 29 deadline. This video is going to be a little bit longer than recent ones because there's lots of important stuff to discuss. So I'm going to talk about whether or not to sell Mo Salah, what to do with Marmoush and Ouattara, then look at my own team and early thoughts on that, plus a Game Week 29 wildcard draft as well. So let's get into it. So I think we've got to start this video by talking about Mo Salah. There's going to be a lot of conversation this week about potentially selling him. And when you talk about potentially selling a player that has broken an FPL record after 28 weeks, naturally a lot of discourse and a lot of negativity comes with that. But I think it's worth talking about why you might, and it's only a might, want to consider taking him out of your squad. But before we get into that, let me state the obvious. You don't have to sell him. Nobody is forcing you to make decisions for your FPL team. You can just keep him. If you want a free hit in 29, great. If you want a wild card and keep Salah in the team, great. If you don't want to go for Haaland, that's fine. If you want to buy Haaland but you've got a route to do it that doesn't involve selling Salah, that is also great. If you want to sell Palmer, brilliant. You can do all of these things. You don't have to sell Salah. Nobody is forcing you to do it, but it's still worth talking about because not everybody's team is the same. There's going to be people watching this whose Game Week 29 team looks brilliant. They've got 3, 4, 5 transfers. They can make luxury moves. Whereas I'm sat there with 2 free transfers. I've got 9 playing players, and 4 of them are Joachim Anderson, Greaves from Ipswich, Ouattara, who probably won't start, and Nwaneri, who's also a worry. So for me, it might make more sense to sell Salah. So that's the obvious. You don't have to do it. Let's talk about the reasons why you might want to consider it. It's an easy way to fund Erling Haaland. Salah, selling him could absolutely punish you. He won't punish you in Game Week 29. He doesn't have a fixture. And you could argue that Haaland is the best captain on paper. Again, if you don't think that and you're happy to captain Bruno Fernandes, Clivert from Bournemouth, Chris Wood or someone like that, that's fine. That's exactly what you should do. But for a lot of people, they want Haaland for captaincy. Salah is an easy way to fund that. And also, Haaland has Leicester at home in Game Week 31 when Salah has Everton at home. Probably right now, I'd rather captain Salah, but I think Haaland is a viable alternative given how bad Leicester can be from a defensive point of view. With Cole Palmer, again, if you can sell him instead of Salah and you've got that luxury because of the amount of transfers you've got, brilliant. But if you don't, Palmer at least has a fixture. Even if it's a bad one against Arsenal away, he's going to get you something from that game, even if it's just 2 points. And also, he's cheaper. So if you're trying to put together a bench boost team later on, for example, you'll need to take a little bit of money out of your 11 to put on the bench. It's probably easier to accommodate Palmer than it is Salah. And I get it. Palmer has been awful recently. Is not worth 11 million, but that can quickly change. And they've still got pretty good fixtures, even though he's blanked against Southampton and Leicester. So that's one reason why you might want to keep Palmer over Salah, mostly because he's just got a fixture this week. And it doesn't feel right to sell players if you're already struggling to put out 11 if they've got a fixture. He's not necessarily needed for captaincy between Game Weeks 29 and 30. Obviously, you could captain him every week where he's got a fixture if you wanted to, but Game Week 29 he's not playing. I've just mentioned that you could captain Haaland in 30 against Leicester at home. In 31, it's a little bit more tricky because Salah's got Fulham away, which is not that bad. Palmer's got Brentford away. You could argue that Brentford away is an easier fixture than Fulham for sure. Or if Isak is fit, he's got Leicester away. So there are alternatives, but Game Week 31 would worry me a little bit. With Game Week 32, that's a double for Palace and Newcastle. So if Isak is fit and available, most people will captain him. And then Game Week 33 will be a double as well. Very likely that Haaland will double. So again, you could captain him or one of the other many players that will have 2 fixtures that week. Salah does have in Game Week 33 Leicester away. You could argue that he's better than all double game week players, but I would suggest that most people, if Haaland has a double that week, would rather captain him than Salah against Leicester away. Now, obviously, even without captaincy, Salah can still get plenty of points and hurt you if you don't own him, but the damage he can do is slightly lessened by the fact that a lot of other people won't captain him even if they own him because of the doubles and stuff like that. There's also rotation potential. There's lots of ifs in this. If Liverpool beat PSG, and the rotation will be after Game Week 34. So you don't have to make any decisions with Salah early this week. Wait until the Champions League matches happen. If Liverpool get knocked out, totally different conversation. I would probably lean way more towards keeping Salah. But if they go through, in the next round, it's Bruges or Aston Villa. So Liverpool will be heavy favourites to get to the Champions League semi-finals, they're also massively ahead in the Premier League. It won't be that long at this rate until they've got the Premier League wrapped up. And the Champions League semi-finals are around the end of April and then the first week of May. So it's around kind of game weeks 35 and then going into game week 36. So if they've got the league wrapped up, we could see Mo Salah rested for the Champions League. And some people will argue that he's going for records he'll want to play. I won't dispute that, but Arne Slot makes the decisions. And ultimately, as good as individual records are, and you want to keep Salah happy, you want him to re-sign for next season, I get all that. A League and Champions League double in your first season as Liverpool manager is huge. So I think if Liverpool beat PSG, they're odds-on favourites to get to the semi-finals. And if that's against, say, Real Madrid, and the Premier League is won, what's more important, Salah's individual records or playing that Real Madrid match? So I think there's possible rotation, but a lot will depend on the PSG game. Easier to fund the bench boost, I already mentioned. And it is a differential. If you feel like you've got nothing left to lose this season and you're not having to create content every week where you get kind of shamed when it goes bad, it's not that bad, to be honest, but like, it is a differential to sell him and just go elsewhere and just hope that the captaincies all the way from 29 to 33 onwards work out. If you've got a free hit left, by the way, you're probably going to use, if you're not using it in 29, you're probably using it in 33 or 34. So you can get him in for one of those weeks anyway, even if you don't own him. But it would be a differential. I would suggest that is probably the worst reason to do it because he is just amazing. I think all the other stuff adds up. So that is the potential reasons to sell him. Again, you do not have to do it. I think sometimes people get it's almost like they get offended with FPL when anyone even considers selling Salah. I know how good he is. You honestly do not need to tell me he's brilliant. But for my team in particular, I'm going to talk about it later, I feel like I'm almost forced to go without him at this stage because my team is such a mess. For those of you that don't need to sell him and that you can still get Haaland, you're in such a good position. Enjoy it because some of us are not in that same place. So if you want to sell him, go ahead, but I would absolutely not make this transfer early. Wait and see what happens midweek. Make your decisions much closer to the deadline. So lots of frustration in game week 28 for Marmoush owners. He was heavily transferred in just to be benched against Nottingham Forest and came on for a 1-point cameo. What do you do with him ahead of game week 29 where most people won't have a bench if they're not free hitting? I think you keep him because with Marmoush, you haven't got a guarantee that he's permanently lost his place. There's some players that you can be pretty sure are not going to start in game week 29. I don't know if Marmoush is one of them. So obviously if you keep him, you risk another 1-point cameo, but he also might just start. And Brighton at home is not an amazing fixture, but it's certainly not terrible either. And if he did get a start in that game, he's absolutely capable of coming away with points. So I think for most people, even if you're sat there with 9 or 10 players and Marmoush is one of them, I think I'd lean more towards keeping him rather than taking a hit. If you can transfer him out for free to someone that's definitely going to play, like Chris Wood, for example, maybe I would do that. But if it's going to take a hit, I would take the risk that he's going to start. The other thing to point out is that we knew on the deadline stream that Marmoush wasn't going to start against Forest. That leak came out. Now, we haven't had a huge amount of leaks for teams recently, but in game week 29, Man City are playing at 3 o'clock, and the deadline for game week 29 is later. It's 1:30 UK time. So there is a chance that you will get information about that Man City team, and it might be that Marmoush starts. It also might be that he's benched, but at least with that information, you can decide what to do. So I think for a lot of players that are potential minutes risks or are not necessarily going to start, I would be tempted to take them out for a hit. But with Marmoush, you can't, because it's a Man City attacker that's not Haaland, you can't guarantee that he's not going to start. Like, he may well be in that 11. So I think I'd lean towards keeping him. The one thing to say, I definitely would not transfer him in. Even if you get a leak that he's starting, unless you're absolutely sure you're going to wildcard in game week 30, I think you've got to ignore him because otherwise you've got the same headache against Leicester at home in 30 about whether or not he'll start. So don't buy him, but if you've already got him, I would lean probably towards keeping him. So like Marmoush, Ouattara was also benched for game week 28. It was Evan Nielsen that started as the number 9 for Bournemouth with Semenyo and Tavernier as the wider players. You could make the same case here not to sell him for a hit because even if he doesn't start, he's almost certain to come off the bench. So that's your 1 point. The 4-point hit would mean whoever comes in would need to get at least 5 to match him, but obviously preferably outscore him. The difference for me is, if I'm doing a predicted lineup for Bournemouth for game week 29 against Brentford, Ouattara is definitely not in that. Not based on what we've seen in the FA Cup and now this last game, Evan Nielsen number 9. Semenyo will definitely play in one of the wider positions. Kluivert is 10. And Tavernier has played a lot of minutes this season. And given he's just started the last game, you have to probably conclude from that Ouattara is going to be on the bench. With Man City, I couldn't guarantee that as much. That's the difference between Marmoush and Ouattara. So for Marmoush, I would probably lean more towards keeping him. With Ouattara, I'd be very tempted to take a hit. I think whichever midfielder you can bring in, like a Kluivert, a Semenyo, a Bruno Fernandes, someone like that, even a Nottingham Forest punt against Ipswich, for me, it's worth that 4-point risk to try and get at least 5 points plus. I think there's plenty of midfielders that are capable of doing that week. It's not a guarantee. You might spend that hit and come out worse off, but I think with Ouattara, it's so unlikely he's going to start. He could do. I just don't see it without injury, so I think I would lean more towards selling him. So early thoughts on my own team for game week 29. Basically, it's an absolute mess. I'm currently in a 4-5-1 formation. I've only got 9 playing players, but 4 of them are Joachim Andersen against Spurs at home. That doesn't scream clean sheet. I don't think it's absolutely terrible if I have to play him. I don't know if I would take a hit to avoid having to put him in the 11, but it's not a great option. Greaves against Forest at home, not expecting a clean sheet for Ipswich. I'd have to be relying on him getting me a goal. Wanyeri, who was just subbed off before the 60th minute against Man United, far from ideal that when Martinelli came on, Merino stayed on the pitch. So even though right now, if I had to guess, Wanyeri will probably start against Chelsea, he's another headache and a minute's risk. And then Ouattara, who I've just mentioned, I don't think will start in game week 29. So actually, in terms of playing players who are good, in my team, I've got 5, I reckon. Pickford and Mikalenko against West Ham at home. Gabriel against Chelsea at home. Palmer against Arsenal away, although some people would argue he's bad as well. And then in Burma against Bournemouth away. So 5 good players and 4 dodgy ones, right? And I've only got 2 free transfers to fix it. Some people would say this screams free hit. I'm almost certainly not going to free hit. Obviously, by doing that, I would get salaries at Trent and Watkins back for game week 30, which would massively help. But I've still got to play one of Greaves, Anderson, Mikalenko. They've all got bad fixtures in game week 30. Wanyeri would still be a risk, and so would Ouattara, and Cunha would still be suspended. So free hit is just out of the question for me. I might wildcard, and I'll talk about what that draft might look like in a minute. Or I'm going to take hits. I reckon I'm taking at least a -8 this week. And as it stands, I'm kind of 70-75% sure that I'm going to sell Salah. I think I'm just going to go for it and get Haaland, captain him this week, captain him against Leicester, and then figure out what to do with Salah later on. The worst case scenario, which I didn't talk about earlier, is I just wildcard Salah back in. The biggest issue is the team value. I would lose 0.6 million by selling him and then having to buy him back. But obviously the hope would be that I wouldn't need to buy him back. But that's not a guarantee. So no decisions being made early. If I take a -8 that involves selling Salah, it will probably look something like Salah, Cunha, Watkins, Ouattara, to Kluivert, Semenyo, Haaland and Evan Nielsen. So a triple up on Bournemouth for Brentford at home, but getting their nailed on attackers. And then also having that triple up in game week 30 for Ipswich at home. Because remember, if I don't wildcard this week, it's not a guarantee I'll wildcard in 30 because I'll want to wait for the double game week information. The only good thing about wildcard 30 over 29 is you've got the FA Cup quarter-final results. So even if the Premier League haven't confirmed the double game weeks, the fixture gurus like James Planet FPL, Tarlan, Nadeem, Ben Crellin, etc. on Twitter, they will probably have a good idea of what it's going to look like. So at least in game week 30, you've got that info. But if I do want to wait until 31, having that triple up on Brentford for Ipswich at home in game week 30 will look pretty good. So I think as it stands, free hit is out of the question. Also, I think people are underestimating how useful free hit will be later on to manage game week 33 and 34. Either you'll free hit in the double for 33, and then your team will just look good in 34 for the blank, or you'll be well set for the double and you'll just free hit in the blank instead. It's very useful to manage that situation. In some ways, even more than a wild card. So I really don't want to use it this week. So it's either a -8. By the way, I could just not get Haaland, but even in that situation, I still think I'm taking a -8. Watkins to Wood, Cunha to Evan Nielsen, then I'm still left with playing Ouattara and Wanyeri. So I'm probably, I guess at a minimum, I could sell just Ouattara, right, to Kluivert and just play Wanyeri and maybe take like a -4. But then I've got a captain like Chris Wood, which is fine, I guess, but I just want to captain Haaland. So I think I'm either wildcarding or selling Salah. my team is just a mess. I'm really looking forward to just getting through this week, and hopefully it's damage limitation. Let's talk about what a wildcard draft could look like. So this is the first draft that I came up with for Wildcard 29. Just a quick point that up until yesterday, I hadn't even considered wildcarding in 29 at all. So this draft will definitely need some work. The most difficult thing is trying to work out how the team will be affected based on different FA Cup results. Because the FA Cup quarterfinals being played after 29 and before Game Week 30 will dictate what double Game Week 33 and blank Game Week 34 look like. If you're wildcarding this week, you're going in blind basically and hoping that you can deal with whatever eventuality ends up happening. From what I've looked at so far, I definitely think this is a viable strategy, but only if you've got your free hit left. If you're wildcarding in 29 and you've got no free hit to manage double Game Week 33 and blank Game Week 34, that probably gets quite difficult. It's already hard enough knowing that I've got a free hit to bail me out. So in that situation, I'd probably play through 29 and wildcard later. In terms of what could happen in the FA Cup, I think the worst result for this draft and this strategy would be a Crystal Palace win. Sorry, Crystal Palace fans, but I'm just talking about FPL only. A Palace win against Fulham and Bournemouth not to win. Because in that scenario, you would have obviously bought 3 Crystal Palace players for the double in 32. Then they'll also double in 33, so that's a good thing. And I've also got a couple of Arsenal players in this draft. If Palace win in the FA Cup, Arsenal will also double. The problem is, without the Bournemouth win, you're in a position where you've probably got 6 or 7 doublers for 33. So you're not quite at 11. But also, you've got 3 Crystal Palace and 2 Arsenal players and probably a couple of Man City that are all going to blank in 34. So you've got kind of 6, 7, 8 doublers, but then 6, 7, 8 blankers. So you're not quite prepared for 34. You probably need to free hit, but you're also off getting 11 doublers in 33. So you've got to hope you've got enough transfers. If Crystal Palace don't win, I think this strategy works really nicely. But that's the problem. You're reliant on one result, which is pretty much a coin flip between Fulham and Palace. Both of those teams could win. I will say this, if you wildcard 29 and all the favourites win in the FA Cup, so let's say Fulham because they're at home, Aston Villa, Man City and Brighton because they're at home as well, then this strategy works really decently because you'll be fine for Game Week 34 in the blank. You can just make a couple of transfers to deal with it, and free hit 33 will be really nice. You can't really get too screwed over, but there's just so many ifs and buts based on the FA Cup results. And I think a Crystal Palace win and a Bournemouth loss to Man City is probably worst case scenario, but still potentially manageable because if you're wildcarding this week, you're going to get to save transfers over the next few weeks. So there's lots of reasons to consider it, right? Some people will look at this team and think, well, my team can almost be as good with a couple of transfers. Great. You're in a much better position than other people. My team is not like that. So this is what... Anyway, let's get into the draft, right? I've talked 3 minutes about what could potentially happen. Kepa in goal as one of my Bournemouth players. Gabriel, Vardiol and Nico Williams back 3. Midfield 5 is Palmer. I'd love to have Salah, but he doesn't have a fixture this week. He's also more expensive. Bruno Fernandes, Trossard, Semenyo and Elanga from Nottingham Forest. Then up front, it's Haaland and Evan-Nielsen. So it's a 3-5-2 for Game Week 29. You've got to stack your bench with non-playing players. You have to prepare for the double in 32. So that's Crystal Palace and Newcastle players. I've gone for Henderson from Palace and then 3 Newcastle. Isak, Livramento, Dan Burn. Now, one thing people are going to point out, I don't have Munoz. You're absolutely right. You should probably have him on your wildcard draft. I would like to have him instead of Dan Burn, for example. The only reason I don't is when I go through transfers over Game Weeks 30, 31, 32, preparing for that double for Palace and Newcastle in particular, it's much easier to manage buying Eze and Sarr than it is having Munoz in the team. Because basically, if you put in Munoz instead of one of the Newcastle defenders, if you want to go for 6 doublers in 32, you've then got to buy like Eze or Sarr plus Anthony Gordon. Unless you want to buy like a Jacob Murphy potentially, but I would want to go for Anthony Gordon over Murphy. And in that scenario, it's just more expensive. Munoz is more expensive than Burn, and Gordon is more expensive than Eze and Sarr. So the budget for my team gets tight. But honestly, I probably, if I end up wildcard in 29, I'll probably figure out a way to just get Munoz because I think it just makes more sense. Like, he's such a good pick like playing as a wing back, genuine goal threat. You probably should have him in your team, but I just wanted to explain why I currently don't. Another way I like setting this up is instead of Kepa having Raya and instead of Fernandes having Kluivert, so triple Bournemouth attack. And then basically, Semenyo, Kluivert, Trossard and Elanga all have potential to double in 33. So once you've got that information from the FA Cup quarterfinals, you can then choose which of those players to sell to Crystal Palace midfielders. So the idea would be, wildcard this week, don't use my transfers. Game week 30, roll. Go into game week 31 with 3 free transfers. Probably roll again. It would mean not having Eze or Sarr for... Oh, sorry, it would involve having no Crystal Palace attackers with this draft in game week 30. But honestly, Palmer's got Brentford, Trossard's got Fulham, I think it is. Triple Bournemouth would have Ipswich, and Haaland's good, and you have Isak off the bench as well. So it all looks fine, right? Palmer's not got Brentford. He's got... I'm getting confused now. Palmer has got, who is it? Spurs at home in game week 30, which is absolutely fine, right? So no transfers in 30, no transfers in 31. I personally, for my team, would get to 32 if all things go well with 4 transfers, and I've got to get 2 Palace players in. So I'd likely get Eze and Sarr, and I would choose which midfielders to sell based on what's happened in the FA Cup. And then I've got a couple more transfers later on, and I can either free hit 33 or I can free hit 34. It ain't perfect. It can absolutely go wrong. The FA Cup could screw you over. You get injury suspensions. People wildcarding in 30 or 31 will have all that information. They'll be able to set up much better. You might go without Mateta. Everyone goes Mateta. He absolutely smashes it. I might go without Munoz. He might continue smashing it. It can go wrong. If your team does not need a wildcard, don't do it. I would much rather save it for 30 or 31. But some people are in a dire position where they've got to consider it. The other slight problems with this draft, Nico Williams, even though he has started many, many games in a row, I always worry that Moreno might start the odd one. And so I think right now, Forest are playing really well. Why would Nuno change it? But he could change it at some point. So if you can afford like Milenkovic or Murillo, someone like that, I would get him. I would get them instead. And also, if I go for the Semenyo, Kluivert, Evan Nielsen route, their game week 30 against Ipswich is not that long after their FA Cup match against Man City. There might be a rotation. And Kluivert got rotated in the last FA Cup match. So maybe he plays against City and then is benched against Ipswich. So there are slight concerns. But generally, and the same with Trossard, right? Ranieri just got subbed before 60 and Marino stayed on. I think Trossard's minutes are pretty good. Like even when Martinelli and Saka come back, you would imagine that Trossard will play as a 9. But maybe he won't. Maybe Marino will play with Saka and Martinelli either side. So Trossard's also a concern. But some of these players need to be sold. And you can make that decision later. What else is there to say? Gun to my head, right? If I had to use a chip this week and it was free hit this week or wildcard later or wildcard this week, free hit later, I'd wildcard this week. I honestly think the free hit to manage 33 and 34 is probably better than a wildcard. And also you can set your team up nicely for 29 and it looks really good for game week 30 as well. Whereas free hit for my team would still look pretty terrible in game week 30. Anyway, I've rambled on. I'm not sure how much more I can go into it right now. I need to give it some more thought. Basically, short thing, I think it's viable. It could absolutely go wrong. You've got to be prepared for that. And also, I've got no Salah. So I'm still selling Salah even on wildcard. To put him in here is really difficult. It'd have to be instead of Palmer. I've got to find another 2 million from somewhere. And I've got to have a different player on the bench. So I can't stack for Newcastle and Palace. So I think you've got to go without Salah. Anyway, that's a longer video than normal, but there's a lot of key things to discuss this week. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button. Rate 5 stars if you listen on podcasts, and I'll catch you tomorrow for transfer tips.